I'm not a party political person. So I was briefly involved in the Labour Party once upon a time back in the 1980s. My feeling at the moment is that the parties, all of them, seem to be more hostile to women than they ever were back in the 1980s when I was briefly in the Labour Party. There seems to be no recognition of feminism now. It's completely shocking. And the behaviour towards women in those parties who are trying to raise anything to do with women is really oppressive. So I don't put my energies into political parties. And the trouble is, those who are right now, like you, are having really terrible trouble. I mean, I've always argued the women's liberation movement needs to work outside parties. We put the pressure on from the outside, and in the end, we make it impossible for anybody to do anything but support us by the sheer amount of the uprising that is going on, rather than working specifically through political party channels. But that is just my position. And that may be not what you choose to do, but I wish you very good luck, because working with these men who are furious when feminism is raised is extremely difficult to do. I don't think we're going to be able to do that. But actually, without the support of the medical profession, of course, they would not have ever existed. And now they're saying that they have to be accepted, and the medical profession's the enemy because they're the gatekeepers now. They're saying that actually there's nothing wrong with them. They're all completely sane and perfectly ordinary, and the medical profession's oppressive. But the medical profession, of course, invented them. So, yeah, I don't know how we get rid of the DSM. That question is often raised. I mean, when you fight pornography, people say, well, what is feminist pornography? Well, of course, there isn't any feminist pornography, certainly not any feminist video pornography. The women are still taking the drugs to survive, and so on and so on. So I'm not a sex advice person. So I'm not in a position. I did write in Anti-Climax, my book from 1990, that what we need to do is eroticize equality. And we need to talk more to each other about what eroticizing equality is. We need to talk about what the opposite is, which is the sort of sadomasochistic sexuality of male dominance, what it feels like, how we get rid of sadomasochistic sexual fantasy. We did talk about all of that in the 1980s. So there are certain parameters within which we can talk, but exactly what the erotic equality is going to look like is hard for me to say, I think. There is this problem with the word perversion, obviously, that it suggests it's a perversion from something. And obviously what the men who invent that term think it's a perversion from is missionary position sexual intercourse when a woman lies there and a man does something to her for his pleasure. So that's what they think the normal is. That is not what we think the normal is. Indeed, I think in a sexuality that's women-centered in the future, penis in vagina sex is quite unlikely to be part of it, because that means technologizing the woman's body, the chance of unwanted childbearing or abortion. It's very bad for women's pleasure. It's a good way of transmitting sexually transmitted diseases. And also it is usually in the way that it is carried out, it symbolizes dominance and submission. So there are very many reasons why that's a very strange practice for, if it's done for pleasure, if sex is supposed to be about pleasure, that women should be having to take part in. So I don't necessarily see, as I always used to say to my students, the act of penis in vagina sex taking place very often in the future, unless it's because conception is intended, in which case maybe once or twice a year with candles as a practice that's about creating life or something. I don't otherwise see a reason why that particular practice, I'm sure I'm not supposed to talk about this now, but I don't see why that particular practice is seen as what sex is. The Yogyakarta principles was absolutely crucial. The problem is the feminist movement was, there was very little energy in feminism in 2006, 2007 when the Yogyakarta principles came about. Feminists weren't noticing what was happening. It was horrendous that this thing called gender, which is about sex stereotypes that oppress women, became part of something that was supposedly an international document, although not a UN document. But it's given the weight of that. It's used in policy all over the place. And also it's enormously undermining to lesbian and gay rights, which are very important to me. And it means at the moment that all of these organizations creating policy seem to think that they have to attach to anything about lesbian and gay rights, which are often not seen as very important anymore, the right of men to be wearing women's underwear and so on. That's always getting tied together because that's in the Yogyakarta principles. I do think most people have no idea what transgender rights are. And once they start to find out, as we know, they become critical. I mean, that's something that's happening. How did the capture happen? Well, there were major lesbian and gay organizations, extremely well funded in the States in particular, the National Lesbian and Gay Task Force, and so on. Many people have suggested that what happened was that when they got some of the things that they wanted, and they were, of course, there were marriage rights, which of course I don't agree with, that were agreed in some places, then need to be campaigning so much on that. They needed a new issue to bring the money in, They chose transgenderism. They were very powerful organizations. At Stonewall here, of course, got taken over in this way. And they are the organizations that governments went to. One of the things that happened with AIDS at the time in the 1980s was the government started to use these lesbian and gay organizations, particularly gay organizations, to deal with the AIDS threat, do safe sex education and so on. That happened in Australia. These organizations began to have some influence, and they led the charge, of course, for transgenderism. So they are the ones who have enormous amounts of money. They could do school programs. They could have paid workers. They could have enormous amount of influence behind the scenes. Mostly feminists had no idea that it was happening. But what's happened is that it's constantly being referenced by the Council of Europe and so on. They say they use it as best practice. They say best practice is, there's no reason to say that, and it has no legal status, no, because of course lesbian and gay rights aren't let alone transgenderism, and not in any UN document. But it is used in that way because very, very powerful men with a lot of clout, lawyers and policymakers and so on, have said that this is a very, very important document, and it's seen as having a lot of clout. I can't think of anything to say, Eleanor, apart from all of the things that are already happening and all of the arguments that we're already making. Unfortunately, I don't think there's a magic argument. We're all being very good at putting out all these different kinds of arguments. I prefer to say disovulate and not disseminate, though. I have to say that, because I think disovulate is quite a nice word. So I can't find something for you that isn't all the things we're doing at the moment and that you're doing too. I do know that we have had a very low time. We've had 2 decades of almost no feminism at all, when women have thought of feminism as a dirty word and have absolutely wanted just to support men in everything. It's kind of shocking. We've not got women's liberation such as I was used to and existed in the old days. But I can't say to you what you should say beyond all of the things that I'm quite sure you're doing right now. I think as well that the women have often not seen much pornography and they have no idea what male sexuality is. Men do know. The problem is what the sexologists used to call transvestism, which is men, the vast majority of the men who transgender are heterosexual, and they are men who are sexually excited by women's clothes. Now, some are more persistent than others. And in the old days, there was always a division between the transvestites and the transsexuals. In the 1970s, when the first transvestite organization was created in the UK, the Beaumont Society, they wouldn't let transsexuals in. It was only for transvestites and so on. So they used to have competition between themselves, but the basis is the same, which is they're sexually excited by the idea of being a woman or anything to do with a woman because they're masochists. So that's the basis of it all. Now, transsexuals in the old days were more likely to have surgery, to see themselves as permanently women and so on. All of these divisions have gone. The vast majority of men who transgender now keep their penises because they want sexual excitement. They don't want to lose their penises because it's harder for them to have orgasms and ejaculate if they haven't got a penis. So really those old distinctions are pretty much gone. But for those men who made that investment, some of the older transsexuals who got rid of their penis and have been going into women's toilets for years and trying to pretend they're women and so on. They're very horrified by what the young activists are doing now, the younger activists, because it's queering their pitch. It's making life difficult for them because it's showing what the practice is really about. And it's showing the misogyny, really, which is at the very basis of that practice. So there isn't a distinction, and it would be very wrong to think that there's some kind of the really good transsexuals who are somehow separate from transgender activists. There are some men who are less poisonous than others, it's fair to say, but all of them believe that there is something called gender which they can accidentally get, and it's an incredibly stereotyped and sexist understanding of what a woman is. And it's an idea of femininity that we all as feminists reject, would never have anything to do with. And that is the basis of their practice. If that doesn't exist, well, like the men who are saying they're locked down and they can't go out and prance around being women, who are they anymore? Without that idea of gender, they're just perfectly ordinary men. So why it's very important now is that men who want to support what we are doing, who have transgendered in the past, who've made that mistake, instead of supporting us as transgender, they need to say, actually, we are men, probably go back to their ordinary names, Bob or Harry or whatever. They've a lot to say. And it's very important what they have to say. But they must stop representing themselves as women because that is sexist.
It's extremely hard for us to come up with a coalition just within our country. There are a lot of reasons, primary one being language. We speak a lot of languages. To rally people with a common language becomes the first challenge. That is why it's possible, like organizations like WHRC, LGB Alliance, to sort of gather together people largely from English-speaking countries, and or at least people in other countries that understand English. It becomes easier for you to form a coalition. When I was translating for the declaration, there was no actual terminology for the word lesbian in both the language. We had to sort of explain it using a sentence and then keep writing lesbian in the local language everywhere else. That's where we are at the moment. The laws also don't seem to be very different. The bureaucracy is pretty much the same. The patriarchy and the misogyny is pretty much the same. The homosexuality, the homophobia is pretty much the same. The trouble is, like you said, class beats caste and race. I think I can go so far as to say it's probably the same thing in South Korea, Japan, Bangladesh, Afghanistan, and Pakistan as well. Only, like Anna said, there is no stoning for homophobia here, but they do it in these dark corners where they are given therapy, rape in the form of conversion therapy. Perhaps if something were to be successful in your country, all I have to do is implement it over here. You know, in terms of how you managed to gather the women together, what did you do? How did you push it in the house? What happened? What were the challenges? What were the questions that were raised? The film that got cancelled for my views on transgenderism had nothing to do with transgenderism at all. It was on sexual harassment. So they chose to completely silence the stories of women belonging to the lower caste who are manual scavengers. They chose to completely silence them because the person who made the film has transphobic views. That's the kind of hypocrisy in the urban educated class that I'm dealing with over here. And if you tell me it's exactly the same, I'd believe you. So you think that they will lose your whatever it is that you would contribute financially or support through sharing or whatever, if they think that they'll be losing you? That's not a fear they have, because we are a minority. The people that want to protect the sex-based rights of women, we're a minority. They don't care if you don't support anymore. What they don't want to do, even if they do believe sex-based rights are important, they don't want to hurt the trans group at all, because they are the majority. And by appeasing the trans cult, what they're also appeasing are organizations that support pornography and feminist pornography and minor attracted persons and what have you. So by merely saying trans women are women, they are basically attracting all these people, and they don't care if we don't support them. In fact, they'll be glad. They will cancel you before you cancel them.
My name is Kate Harris. 6 months ago, next week, we set up a group called LGB Alliance. And our primary goal was to destroy the damage that gender identity theory is doing, particularly to lesbians. We're a lesbian-led organisation, but we welcome support from anybody who supports our aims. But we are a broad-based tactical coalition, which means that we make an awful lot of compromises. But our intention is to ensure that every young girl or every young boy growing up who thinks they might be gay has somewhere to go to other than Stonewall and other trans extremist groups. So all the women on this call who are saying, what can we do, what can we do, what can we do? Please do two things. Follow us on Twitter, because we need to be seen to be able to replace and defeat Stonewall. So the more followers we have on Twitter, the more credibility we have. We're already talking to different government departments and saying, you need to have a plurality of views. Gender identity is a myth. It is damaging a generation of young women, and it has to be kicked out of schools. We've won our first goal for 2020, which was to get the Gender Recognition Reform Bill put to one side in Scotland. Our second goal for 2020 is to get the LGBT inclusive curriculum for primary schools withdrawn, because that's supposed to tell children from 5 years and up from September that they all have a gender identity and they could be born in the wrong body. So that's our second goal. And I would say to all the women who are sounding a little bit despondent, don't be despondent. We have Sheila Jeffries, who's just given us a brilliant talk, who's been a thought leader for decades. We have thousands and millions of us all fighting this rubbish. Safe Schools Alliance has just won a huge victory against a basically pornographic curriculum that was fed to children in Oxfordshire. There are so many groups, not only in this country and around the world, who are saying enough. And that's our hashtag on our Twitter account today. It's enough. We're not taking this anymore. So I would say to people, don't be despondent. Do whatever you're doing in whatever way suits you best and keep on fighting.